When the lights went out that evening, I thought it would just be another small inconvenience, a few candles, an early night. But as the house fell into that heavy, suffocating darkness, I realized it wasn't the darkness I feared. It was the stillness. The kind that forces you to notice how long it's been since someone touched your hand without a reason, how many dinners have passed in silence broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. I lit a candle, then another, watching the soft glow creep along the walls, making my familiar living room look almost foreign, almost like someone else's life. That was when the phone rang. His name flashed on the screen, my friend's son. He said he was nearby, caught in the storm, the buses stopped, the roads flooded. His voice was casual, almost apologetic, but there was something else in it too, something I couldn't quite name. I told him to come over. It felt like the practical thing to do. But when I hung up the phone, I stayed there for a moment, staring at the wavering candlelight, knowing something had shifted, though I couldn't tell if it was inside the room or inside me. And now, before I tell you how that one night changed everything, tell me, have you ever done something so small, so innocent, that you thought it couldn't possibly matter? Until you realized, too late, it was the start of something you'd never be able to take back? The storm had been threatening all day, but I didn't think much of it. The forecast said rain, nothing unusual, and I had gone about my routine like always, laundry in the morning, dinner started by late afternoon, a quick call to my husband to ask if he'd be late again. He said yes, in that distracted tone that made it clear he was already thinking about something else, work, probably, or just not thinking about me. That wasn't new. It hadn't been new for years. When the lights snapped off, the suddenness of it startled me. One moment, the kitchen was filled with the warm yellow of the overhead bulb, the next it was black, so black that for a split second I couldn't even see my own hands. I stood still, holding the wooden spoon I'd been using to stir the soup, and listened to the storm battering the windows. The silence inside was so thick it felt like a weight pressing on me. I found the drawer where we kept candles and matches. My hands shook slightly as I lit the first one, though I couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the darkness, or maybe it was something else, something about the way the house looked in that flickering glow, shadows stretching across walls like strangers. The phone rang just as I set a candle on the counter. The screen lit up with his name, my friend's son. I almost didn't answer. It felt strange, him calling me directly. Usually, we spoke only when she was there too, during visits or holidays. But I swiped to accept, my voice cautious as I said hello. His voice came through, a little breathless. He explained that he was nearby, walking home from a friend's place when the buses stopped because of the storm. The roads were too dangerous now, and his phone was almost dead. I didn't know who else to call, he said, and I could hear the rain behind his words, a steady hiss. I hesitated, but not for long. Of course he couldn't stay out there. Come over, I said, surprised by how quickly the words left me. I'll put the kettle on. Just, be careful on the way. When I ended the call, I stayed where I was for a long moment, the match still burning between my fingers until it singed close enough that I had to shake it out. The candlelight swayed, and I felt something unsteady inside me too. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find him standing there, soaked through, his jacket clinging to him and hair dripping water onto the porch. He looked younger in that moment, like a boy caught in the rain, though I knew he wasn't a boy anymore. Sorry, he said, shivering a little as he stepped inside, peeling off his wet jacket. I didn't mean to bother you. You're not a bother, I replied automatically, hanging the jacket over a chair. The words felt too quick, like I needed him to believe them. I led him to the kitchen. The storm outside felt distant from here, just a background hum. He followed me, his footsteps careful on the hardwood floor. I poured hot water into 2 mugs and set one in front of him. The steam curled upward, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The candlelight softened everything. His features, the edges of the room, even the silence between us, it all felt blurred, almost delicate. I found myself talking more than I usually do, filling the space with small observations, stories from the day. He listened, really listened, leaning slightly forward, his wet hair falling across his forehead. It had been a long time since anyone had listened to me like that. I told myself it was just gratitude, that he was here, that the storm hadn't left him stranded. But every time his eyes met mine across the table, something shifted in my chest. Not much, just enough to notice. At one point, the wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the candle flicker, and I jumped slightly. He smiled, not in a teasing way, but softly, like he was seeing something in me I hadn't shown in a long time. The kettle whistled again on the stove, though I hadn't even realized I'd left it on. I turned away to tend to it, grateful for something to do, my back to him for a few seconds. In that tiny pocket of time, I caught my reflection in the darkened kitchen window, a woman holding a chipped teapot, her shoulders slightly hunched. And I wondered, not for the first time, when I had started to look like that. When I turned back, he was still sitting there, his hands cupped around the mug, steam fogging the air between us. His presence filled the room in a way I hadn't expected. We sat like that for another hour, the storm outside slowly calming but the quiet between us growing heavier, thicker, like the dark itself had moved inside. I told myself it was just one night. Just a guest waiting out the rain. But somewhere, in the corner of my mind I didn't want to look too closely at, I already knew it wasn't that simple. The storm didn't let up, and neither did the silence that seemed to have settled over the house. He sat across from me at the table, cradling his mug, steam still rising in thin, twisting lines that vanished into the dim air. I could hear the rain hammering the roof, the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the horizon. It was the kind of storm that made the outside world feel unreachable, like there was only this room, these walls, and the two of us inside it. I told myself that I was just being hospitable, doing what any friend would do for her friend's son. But there was something unsettling about the way the candlelight played tricks on my perception. He looked older somehow, though he wasn't much more than a young man. His face softened in the glow, shadows drawing attention to the curve of his jaw, the quick flicker of his eyes when they met mine. We talked, though not about anything remarkable. He told me about the walk from the bus stop, how the streets were already flooding and the power seemed to be out across the neighborhood. I nodded, adding my own small observations, though my voice felt different, lighter, almost nervous, like I was hearing myself from a distance. I noticed the details I shouldn't have. The way his damp hair stuck to his forehead, the water running down from the ends, dripping occasionally onto his sweater. The faint scrape of his chair when he shifted. The small marks on his hands, paint maybe, or ink, and I found myself wondering about them, what he had been doing before the storm, who he had been with, what his days looked like when they didn't cross with mine. I poured him another cup of tea, mostly to keep my hands busy. The act of doing something ordinary felt like a shield, as though I could keep this moment simple by clinging to routine. But every time my fingers brushed the warm ceramic, every time I set the mug near him and felt his presence just inches away, the quiet thickened. At one point, the storm surged, and the house creaked with the force of the wind. A draft moved through the room, making the candle flames waver. I reached instinctively to steady one of them, and when I glanced up, he was looking at me. Not in the way someone casually looks at someone else, but with an intensity that caught me off guard. There was a pause then, one of those strange, suspended moments that feels longer than it actually is. My breath slowed, as if I were afraid to disturb the air between us. His hand, resting on the table, shifted slightly, just enough for the space between our fingers to narrow. I didn't move mine, and that choice, so small it could have been nothing, felt heavy. We stayed like that for a moment, the storm loud outside, but the house quieter than ever. And then, without a word, something broke the stillness. We kissed. It wasn't planned. There was no build-up, no conversation leading to it. It just happened. A quick, hesitant press of lips, as if we'd both leaned in without thinking and suddenly found ourselves there. The kiss was brief, over almost as soon as it began, but its echo stayed. I pulled back first, blinking, not sure what to say or even if I should say anything. He didn't say anything either. He just looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, maybe even apology. I stood up too quickly, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound sharp in the stillness. "I'll check on the candles in the living room," I murmured, my voice barely steady. It wasn't really an excuse, but it was the only thing I could think of to break that gaze, that moment. I walked into the living room, my steps slower than I meant them to be. The candles there had burned lower, the wax dripping down in uneven trails. I adjusted one, trimmed the wick on another, hands trembling slightly though there was no reason for them to. I thought about what had just happened, trying to make sense of it. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a moment. Just a strange, fleeting mistake in the middle of a storm. But it didn't feel like nothing. The air felt different when I returned to the kitchen. He was still seated, his fingers around the mug though he hadn't taken a sip in minutes. His eyes followed me, cautious now, like he wasn't sure if he'd crossed a line or if I had. I sat down again, carefully this time, folding my hands in my lap to keep them still. Neither of us mentioned it. We spoke of other things, small, safe things. The storm, the neighborhood, the way the power outage would probably last through the night. Words filled the space, but they didn't erase the silence underneath them. I realized then how long it had been since anyone had kissed me in a way that made me feel like it mattered. Not romantic, not passionate, but noticed. It shouldn't have happened, and yet it had. And in that simple, undeniable fact was a quiet weight I couldn't set down. The rain kept falling. The candles burned lower. And the house, for the first time in years, felt like it was holding its breath. The rain didn't ease, not even for a moment, and the sound of it was constant, an unbroken thread of noise that tied the night together. The kiss we shared sat between us like an unspoken fact neither of us knew how to handle. We didn't talk about it. Not then, not as the minutes stretched and the candles burned lower. Instead, we let small words fill the space, meaningless ones, the kind you speak when you need to feel normal. But the weight of that one moment lingered beneath every syllable, in every glance that lasted a heartbeat too long. I stood up to refill the kettle, the simple act giving me an excuse to move, to let the sound of water and the rattle of the pot drown out the pulse in my ears. The kitchen felt warmer than before, and not just from the stove. There was an awareness in every movement now, mine, his, as though we were both too conscious of how close we were. I told myself the kiss had been nothing, an accident of circumstance, the way people sometimes step too close when passing in a narrow hallway. But I knew that wasn't true. You don't accidentally lean forward. You don't accidentally close your eyes. When I turned back, mug in hand, he was watching me. He didn't look away. That was what unsettled me most, not the kiss itself, but his calm, steady gaze afterward, like he wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but he was prepared for any answer. I set the mug down carefully and sat again, folding my hands in my lap. He wrapped his fingers around the cup but didn't drink, just let the steam rise between us. The storm grew louder. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the house, a door creaked shut from the draft. I shivered, though the air wasn't particularly cold. He noticed. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded. "Just the weather." The words sounded thin, but they were all I had. Silence followed, the kind that presses on you until you have to do something to break it. I rose again, walking to the living room to check the candles there, though I already knew they were fine. The wax had dripped into little pools, solidifying around the bases. The flickering light made the familiar furniture look strange, the walls unfamiliar, as though I'd stepped into someone else's home. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to, my back to the kitchen. I could hear him move, the scrape of the chair legs against the floor, the soft tread of his footsteps as he followed me in. When I turned, he was leaning in the doorway, his arms crossed loosely, his head tilted slightly as if he was studying me. "I didn't mean to," he started, then stopped. His voice trailed off, and he gave a small shake of his head. "Never mind." The unfinished sentence hung in the air, but I didn't ask him to finish it. Maybe because I already knew what he might say, and maybe because I didn't want to hear it out loud. I busied myself with rearranging the candles, trimming one wick with the little pair of scissors I kept in a drawer. It was a meaningless task, but it steadied me, let me pretend this was just another storm, just another evening. But even as I focused on the candles, I could feel his presence behind me, the way the room felt smaller when he stepped into it, the way the air seemed to shift when he stood close. I turned slightly, and for the briefest second, our eyes met again. There was no movement, no words, but something in that glance carried the memory of the kiss, the weight of it, and something more, something neither of us dared to name. I broke the moment by pointing to the window. "The rain's coming down harder," I said, my voice even, though my heart wasn't. He stepped closer to look, his shoulder almost brushing mine as he leaned to see. It wasn't an accident, the nearness, but it wasn't deliberate either, it just happened, the way these things do, quietly, without announcement. For a few moments, we stood there, side by side, watching the rain smear the glass, listening to the wind whistle through the edges of the frame. I thought about my husband. About the years we'd spent together, the routines we'd built, the quiet dinners and the silent mornings. He wasn't a bad man. He wasn't unkind. But somewhere along the way, the warmth between us had cooled into something steady, reliable, and faintly cold, like a room you keep heated just enough so the pipes won't freeze. I wondered, as I stood there, when I had stopped noticing that I was lonely. He shifted again, and I felt the movement rather than saw it, the subtle shift of weight that brought him a fraction closer. My breath caught for just a moment, so slight I hoped he hadn't heard it. I moved away then, back toward the kitchen, telling myself I needed to check on the kettle again. I heard his footsteps follow a moment later, slower this time, as though he didn't want to seem like he was following. Back at the table, we sat again, the mugs between us cooling. He picked his up finally, taking a small sip, and set it back down without comment. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was heavy, filled with everything neither of us had said. The kiss still lived there, a small, sharp truth neither of us could undo, and yet neither of us seemed ready to address it either. Instead, we let the night stretch on. The storm raged. The candles burned lower. And in that soft, dim light, we sat across from each other, aware of every inch of space between us, and of how easy it would be to cross it again. The rain outside had softened slightly, shifting from a furious downpour to something steadier, a relentless curtain of water that blurred the world beyond the windows. Inside, the air felt heavy, almost dense, and the weight of the evening pressed in on me from every corner of the room. I had thought, at some point, that the storm might bring with it a sense of stillness, an excuse to do nothing but wait it out, but instead it seemed to have cracked something open, something I couldn't quite close again. The kitchen table had become our anchor, but it was starting to feel too small for the silence that sat between us. Every clink of ceramic against wood, every slow exhale seemed amplified, filling the room with things unsaid. The kiss from earlier hadn't vanished into the air like steam, it lingered, shaping how we looked at each other, how we avoided looking at each other, how we moved in and out of the room with an odd, careful awareness. I stood again, my legs carrying me into the hallway without much thought, as if I needed space, or maybe as if I was afraid to stay in one place for too long. The hallway was dark, only faintly lit by the spill of candlelight from the kitchen. I touched the wall as I walked, feeling the cool paint under my fingertips, grounding myself in the ordinary walls, doors, familiar corners of a home that had been mine for decades. He followed a few steps behind. I didn't turn to look at him, but I could hear him, the quiet weight of his steps, the pause when I paused, the way he seemed to hover just out of reach. It wasn't invasive, not exactly. It was more like he didn't want me to be alone in the dimness. I found myself in the living room again, staring at the half-melted candles. Wax had pooled on the saucers beneath them, forming uneven shapes, hardened in mid-drip. The flames cast shifting shadows across the walls, and for a fleeting second, the room looked unfamiliar, like I had stepped into someone else's home entirely. I picked up one of the candles to move it, and behind me I heard him speak, softly, almost tentative. "Do you think the power will be out all night?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice steady but quieter than I meant it to be. "Sometimes these things take hours. Sometimes days." The thought hung there. Days. I wondered, absurdly, what that would mean, being trapped in this new, delicate imbalance for more than just a night. He moved closer, not enough to touch, but enough that I felt it, the subtle shift in the air, the awareness of another body near mine. My pulse quickened, though nothing was happening, nothing was being said. I set the candle down and stepped out onto the small balcony. The sliding door groaned slightly as I opened it, letting in the smell of wet concrete, the faint metallic scent of rain-soaked air. The storm had tamed a little, but the streets below were slick, puddles reflecting what little light there was from neighboring houses. I rested my hands on the cold railing, staring out, pretending for a moment that I was only there to look at the rain. He stepped out behind me, and suddenly the narrow balcony felt smaller. I didn't move away, though I could have. I stayed where I was, my fingers gripping the rail just slightly tighter, as if that made it less noticeable that he was standing so close. The conversation we started was light, almost meaningless. He told me about the neighborhood he'd grown up in, about the time he'd tried to build a treehouse that never quite held together. I listened, grateful for words, any words, to fill the air. But even in those small stories, there was an intimacy I hadn't expected, like he wasn't just telling me about his past, but offering me pieces of it. And I realized, standing there in the damp air, that I was listening differently than I usually do. I wasn't just hearing him. I was feeling the pauses between his sentences, the quiet weight of his voice. A gust of wind sent a spray of rain across the edge of the balcony, and instinctively I pulled the shawl around my shoulders tighter. Before I realized it, he'd reached to help, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric and against me. It was nothing. A fleeting, practical gesture. But my body reacted as if it were something more, a quiet spark running under my skin. I turned slightly to look at him, and for just a moment, his gaze met mine. There was nothing overt in it, no overt suggestion, no boldness, just a kind of searching, as if he was trying to understand what I was thinking, or if I even knew myself. I looked away first, my eyes finding the rain again. The conversation shifted then, almost imperceptibly, to quieter things. He asked what I wanted when I was his age, what dreams I'd had that I'd never followed. The question startled me, not because it was bold, but because no one had asked me that in years. I tried to answer, but the words felt strange in my mouth. "I don't know," I said after a long pause. "Or maybe I did once, and I've just forgotten." He nodded, like he understood something I didn't say. The rain was steady, and we stayed there longer than I realized, two figures on a small balcony, speaking softly about things we didn't normally talk about. At some point, I turned to go back inside. The room was warmer than the balcony, but stepping back into it didn't bring relief. If anything, the closeness of the walls, the dim light, made everything sharper. He stayed behind for a moment, then followed, closing the balcony door gently behind him. The candles burned lower, the wax pools spreading. The living room smelled faintly of smoke and rain. And as I sat back down, smoothing the folds of the shawl across my lap, I felt something in me settling into a strange, fragile awareness. The night wasn't over. And the space between what had happened and what might happen next felt impossibly thin. The night deepened around us, and the storm outside finally eased into a soft, steady drizzle. The living room had grown quieter, the candles dwindling, casting low, warm pools of light across the furniture and walls. The rain against the windows was a constant, gentle rhythm, like a metronome keeping time with the tension that had settled between us. I was aware of every small sound, his breathing, the slight shuffle as he moved in his chair, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. The room felt smaller somehow, more intimate, the space between us charged without words to fill it. He reached across the table, a slow, deliberate motion, and his fingers brushed mine. The touch was light, tentative, but it was enough to send a ripple through me. It wasn't bold or demanding, just a gentle seeking, and I found myself responding without thinking, leaning in just enough to close the distance. We kissed. The kiss was soft, unhurried, the kind that lingers in memory longer than the moment itself. It wasn't a spark or a flame, it was something steadier, quieter, but no less real. When we parted, the air between us felt charged, but there was no need for words to explain what had happened. I noticed the way his eyes held mine, searching, waiting for some sign, some permission to go further or step back. I felt a mix of emotions, excitement, fear, and something like hope, all tangled together in a way that made it impossible to separate one from the other. The room seemed to pulse with a new energy, the storm outside fading into the background as the storm inside took hold. We talked then, cautiously, carefully, as if we were navigating a path without a clear map. His voice was quieter now, more deliberate. He shared stories from his childhood, moments of laughter and loss, dreams he hadn't yet chased. I listened, absorbing the details, feeling the distance between us shrink with each word. I told him about my own past, about the life I'd built, the years that had passed almost without notice. I spoke of the small disappointments, the quiet loneliness that had settled in the spaces between routine and responsibility. I didn't paint it as a tragedy, more like a slow fading of color from a once vivid picture. He didn't judge or pity. Instead, he offered understanding, a kind of empathy that felt rare and precious. At one point, the wind outside picked up again, rattling the windows and sending a shiver through the house. I pulled a shawl tighter around my shoulders, and he reached out to help, his fingers brushing against mine as he adjusted the fabric. The contact was brief, but it spoke volumes in the silence that followed. We moved to the balcony, the air cooler and fresher outside. The city lights were blurred by the rain, and the streets gleamed wet and reflective beneath the street lamps. We stood side by side, watching the world through the veil of rain, the night stretching out before us. He told me about places he wanted to visit, the art he wanted to create, the life he hoped to lead. His words were full of possibility, of dreams not yet realized. I felt myself pulled into his vision, imagining a different life alongside his. But beneath the hope, there was a shadow, an awareness of the impossible. Of the consequences waiting beyond the fragile bubble we'd created in this storm-darkened house. Returning inside, the warmth of the room enveloped us again, but the tension remained, a silent acknowledgement that everything had shifted. The candles flickered low, the wax melting into glossy pools, and I sat back down, feeling the weight of the night settle onto my shoulders. The choice to let this happen was no longer a question of if, but what next. And somewhere deep inside, I knew there was no turning back. The house had grown unbearably quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of something heavier, an awareness, a weight in the air. The rain had softened to a faint mist outside, and the storm that had been an unrelenting wall between us and the world was now more like a whisper. But inside, everything still felt suspended, like the night hadn't decided what it was going to be. I moved to the kitchen counter, gathering cups and rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. The motions were clumsy, but they gave me something to do, a rhythm to keep my mind from thinking too hard about what had already happened, or what might happen next. He stayed seated for a while, quiet, his hands resting on the table. I could feel his eyes on me, not heavy or invasive, just there. Present. When I turned to bring another candle into the room, he was suddenly closer. I hadn't heard him move, but there he was, holding one of the smaller candles, shielding the flame with his hand so it wouldn't blow out as he carried it from one room to another. The sight of that small gesture, so ordinary and almost tender in its simplicity, caught me off guard. The room looked different in that scattered glow, darker at the edges, brighter where the flames reached. He set the candle down, and for a moment, our hands brushed again. A light, brief touch, but enough to set my heart beating faster than it should have. The phone rang then, startling both of us. A sharp, cutting sound in the stillness. My husband's name lit up the screen. I hesitated before answering. My voice was even casual, as I told him the power was still out, the storm was still bad, that I'd managed to find a few candles and everything was fine. He asked if I needed him to come home, his tone practical, more an offer than real concern. No, I said, too quickly, then softened it with a smile he couldn't see through the phone. Stay where you are. The roads are dangerous. When I hung up, the silence felt thicker. He'd heard the conversation. He knew my husband wasn't coming back tonight. I set the phone down and found my hands trembling slightly. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice. I pressed my palms flat on the table to still them. He had pulled a small notebook from his bag, a sketchpad with rough edges. I watched, curious, as he flipped through pages, some filled with lines and shapes, others blank. He picked up a pencil and began to draw, his head bent slightly, his hand moving in quiet strokes. I stood there, watching without meaning to intrude. There was something grounding about the way he sketched, focused, calm, like the world outside the paper didn't matter for those moments. What are you drawing? I asked softly, almost without thinking. He glanced up, a flicker of a smile on his face. Nothing yet, he said, then looked back down. I stepped closer, my breath catching before I realized I'd done it. The lines on the page began to take shape, a curve here, a shadow there. It wasn't finished, but I saw hints of familiarity. The arch of a shoulder, the fall of hair. I didn't ask if it was me. I didn't have to. I turned away, not because I was uncomfortable, but because the weight of that small act, the choice to draw me, was almost too much to hold in that moment. I busied myself with more meaningless tasks, folding the throw blanket draped across the arm of the couch, adjusting the candle on the table by an inch. All while thinking about the quiet sound of his pencil moving across the page. At some point, I left the room to fetch extra blankets from the closet. The hallway was dim, lit only by the small flame of the candle I carried, and I felt the shift in the air when he followed a few steps behind. I opened the closet, pulling down blankets one by one, stacking them in my arms. The mundane weight of them felt oddly grounding, a reminder that, whatever was unfolding, there were still practical things to be done. I turned, and he was standing close enough that I nearly brushed against him when I stepped out. The hallway felt narrow, the walls closer than I remembered. Thanks, I murmured, not for anything specific, just for his presence, for the way he seemed to silently help without being asked. We carried the blankets back to the living room. I laid one across the couch, another over the chair, smoothing the fabric with deliberate care. He watched for a moment, then set his sketchpad down beside him. The house creaked softly as it settled, the wind outside a faint hum now. I sat, pulling a blanket around my shoulders, feeling the familiar weight settle over me. But nothing felt entirely familiar anymore. There was no more pretending we hadn't crossed a line. And though neither of us spoke it out loud, we both knew it was no longer just about the storm. The night had shifted into something else entirely. It wasn't the same evening that had begun hours ago when the lights went out and the storm swallowed the street. The air in the house felt different now, thicker, heavier, as though every candlelit corner carried the weight of what had already happened and the gravity of what we both knew might happen next. The silence between us was not the quiet of strangers waiting for the storm to pass, it was charged, humming with the awareness of lines already crossed and the pull of ones we hadn't yet dared to. I sat on the edge of the couch, smoothing the blanket across my knees though it didn't really need smoothing. The motion was automatic, a way to keep my hands busy, but I felt every gesture, every breath, every shift of my body, as if it were under a spotlight. He was across from me, sitting low in the chair, the sketchpad still open on the table beside him. Pencil lines etched out the beginnings of a drawing, my shape, my outline, a version of me seen through his eyes. I tried not to stare at it, but my gaze kept flicking back to the page, to the way he had captured me, not just what I looked like, but something deeper, something I hadn't seen reflected in a long time. He spoke softly, asking if I needed another blanket, another cup of tea. His voice was cautious, careful, like he was testing the ground with each word. I shook my head, but the offer lingered between us, not just about tea or blankets, but something larger, an unspoken willingness to care, to tend, to step into a space that hadn't been his to step into until tonight. Outside, the rain had almost stopped. Only a faint drizzle remained, a whisper of the storm that had once been loud enough to drown everything else out. Without that noise, the house felt exposed, as if we could hear our own thoughts bouncing off the walls. I stood and moved to the window, looking out at the slick streets, the puddles catching the dim reflections of distant porch lights. Behind me, I heard him rise too, his steps quiet but certain, closing the space until he was there beside me. For a long moment, we stood shoulder to shoulder, staring out at the rain-washed street, neither speaking. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it wasn't light either, it was dense, loaded with everything neither of us was saying. When I turned slightly to glance at him, his eyes met mine. That simple meeting of gazes carried more weight than it should have. He didn't touch me at first, and I didn't touch him, but the space between us wasn't really space at all, it felt like a thread pulled taut, just waiting. I took a breath, slow and deliberate, and felt the air shift when he mirrored me. And then, without needing words or explanations, we crossed the line we'd been circling all night. We spent the night together. It was quiet, not rushed or frantic, but with an unspoken certainty that left no room for denial. The house seemed to hold its breath around us, the candles burning low, the rain outside no longer the loudest thing in the world. After, the silence felt different, not empty, but fragile. Like the first few moments after glass has cracked but hasn't yet shattered. I sat on the edge of the couch again, the blanket pulled over my shoulders, my fingers clutching at the fabric though I wasn't cold. He was across from me, the sketchpad still open but ignored now, his head bowed slightly, as if he too was sifting through the enormity of what had just happened. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The air didn't need words. I looked around the room, at the soft pools of candlelight, at the familiar furniture that now felt like the backdrop to something unrecognizable. The house was still the same. But I wasn't. And we weren't. There was no way to erase it, no way to fold the night back into neat corners and pretend it hadn't spilled into something else. I wondered if he felt the same fear and wonder tangled together inside him, the way I did. I didn't ask. And he didn't tell me. But in the quiet, I think we both knew the answer. Morning arrived not gently, but like a hand pulling back a curtain too quickly, flooding the room with light I wasn't ready for. The first thing I noticed was the brightness. The lamps hadn't been turned on, but the electricity had come back, and every appliance hummed faintly in the background, every corner of the house suddenly visible again. The shadows that had softened the room all night were gone, and in their place was the kind of clarity I didn't want. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from my shoulders, pooling at my waist. The house felt colder now, though the air wasn't any different. It was the change in light, the way it cut through the room, showing everything for what it was. I turned, half expecting to see him there, but the space was empty. The chair where he had been sitting was bare, the small pillow he'd rested against shifted slightly, as if moved in a hurry. His jacket, which had been hanging over the chair near the door, was gone. I didn't hear him leave. I didn't hear the door open or close, and the absence of that sound felt like something missing from my memory. It was as if the night had simply unraveled in the quiet hours before dawn, and now there was only this, an empty room, bright and unrelenting. I stood, my body feeling heavier than it had hours earlier, and scanned the room as if looking for proof that the night had really happened. The candles were still there, but burned down almost to nothing, hardened puddles of wax framing the bases. The teacup sat on the table, cold now, one with a faint ring of dried tea clinging to the rim. And then I saw it. On the table, where his sketchpad had been the night before, there was a single sheet of paper. I stepped closer, my fingers hesitating before picking it up. It was a drawing. Of me. Not just a likeness, but me as I had been last night, sitting in the soft glow of candlelight, my shawl wrapped loosely around my shoulders, my expression unreadable. He'd captured something I didn't even realize was visible, something quiet and fragile, something I hadn't seen in my own reflection for years. The drawing made it undeniable. Whatever had happened, it hadn't been imagined, it hadn't been some fleeting slip I could explain away. I set the drawing down carefully, almost reverently, and let my hand rest on it for a moment. The house creaked softly, settling under the weight of the morning. I moved through it slowly, almost cautiously, like I was afraid to wake something. I gathered the burned-out candles, scraping hardened wax from their holders. I folded the blankets we'd used, smoothing out the creases, tucking them back into the closet. It felt like erasing evidence, though no one had accused me of anything. I found his empty teacup on the counter, rinsed it out, and set it to dry. I did the same with mine, scrubbing harder than necessary, as if the pressure of my hands could scrub away what had happened. But even as I cleaned, I kept glancing back to the drawing on the table. I thought of my husband then, how he would walk through the door tonight, tired but steady, the way he always did. I thought of what I would say, of how easily I could keep my voice level, my words casual, my actions neat. But the truth wasn't neat. I pressed my palms flat against the countertop and closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the coolness of the surface beneath my skin. In that stillness, I realized I wasn't just tidying a room, I was trying to tidy myself, to pull everything I'd felt last night into some box I could close. But there are some nights you can't fold away, no matter how hard you try. I picked up the drawing again and held it for a long time, my fingers brushing over the lines. I wondered if he had meant to leave it, if it was intentional or if he'd forgotten it in his rush to go. And in that wondering was another thought I couldn't shake. He had left. He hadn't waited for the morning, hadn't sat across from me while the first light filled the house. He had walked out quietly, leaving only the sketch behind. There was no note. No message. Just the drawing. And that, somehow, was louder than any words he could have written. I placed it carefully inside one of the books on the shelf, not hidden exactly, but not left in the open either. It felt safer there, pressed between pages, like a secret only I would find. I stood for a long time by the window, staring out at the wet streets. The rain had stopped completely now, the sky a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that comes after storms. The world outside was calm again. But inside me, nothing was calm. The hours after his leaving felt heavier than the night itself. There's a certain kind of quiet that only comes after something irreversible. When the house doesn't just seem empty, it feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for you to react. I walked through each room slowly, the way you do after guests leave, gathering stray cups, folding blankets, smoothing cushions. But this wasn't just tidying up, it felt like I was trying to erase something, to undo traces that couldn't really be undone. Every surface I wiped, every corner I straightened only reminded me more of what had happened and how deeply it had threaded itself into the fabric of the house. The drawing wasn't on the table anymore. I had slipped it into a book on the shelf, pressing it between pages as though that could make it less real. But even hidden, I felt its presence, like the house itself remembered it. By mid-morning, the storm was a memory. The sky outside had cleared to a thin, washed-out blue, and the streets were slick with light. Neighbors were coming out of their houses, stepping over puddles, dragging branches out of the road. The normal world was returning. I heard the front gate creak as someone passed by, and the sound jolted me. For a brief moment, I thought it might be him coming back. But it wasn't, it was just the neighbor walking her dog, waving absently at my window without even noticing I was standing there. I stood still for a long time, watching them, feeling like I was separated from them by more than just glass. Around noon, my phone rang again. My husband's name lit up the screen. I answered, my voice steady. He told me he would be home that evening, that the roads had cleared and the work he'd stayed for was finally finished. He asked how the night had been, if the storm caused any trouble. I said the power had gone out, but it was fine. I said I'd lit some candles, made tea, kept busy. I said nothing else. When the call ended, I stared at the phone for a long time before setting it down. The normality of his voice, the ease of the conversation, made what had happened feel almost unreal. Almost. I started cleaning again, not because the house needed it, but because I needed the motion. I scrubbed the counters, rinsed the dishes, even dusted the shelves. Every movement was a distraction, a way to fill the space so I wouldn't have to sit still with my thoughts. But thoughts aren't so easily scrubbed away. Every time I paused, even for a second, I saw him again, sitting in the chair, sketching, looking up at me in the dim light. I felt the weight of the way his gaze had lingered, the unspoken things between us. I wondered if he thought about it now, wherever he had gone. If he regretted it, or if he left because he couldn't stay, or simply because leaving felt easier. I didn't blame him for going. But the quiet way he did it, the absence of a goodbye, the silence of the door, made something inside me ache in a way I hadn't expected. I folded the last blanket and placed it neatly on the back of the couch. The living room looked exactly as it had the day before, but it wasn't the same room. I wasn't the same woman who had sat there, lighting candles when the storm began. I moved to the kitchen and opened the window. Cool air drifted in, carrying the smell of wet streets and faint traces of rain. It smelled like something ending, or maybe like something that never really began. I leaned against the counter and closed my eyes for a moment. For years, I'd lived in this house with routines so steady they felt like walls. But one night, one single night, had changed the shape of those walls. And now, no matter how carefully I cleaned or folded or put things back in place, I couldn't make them look the way they had before. By late afternoon, the house looked almost exactly as it had before the storm. The blankets were folded neatly over the back of the couch, the dishes had been washed and dried, and the faint smell of wax had faded now that the burned-down candles were gone. Everything was in its place, yet nothing felt in place. I moved from room to room, not with any real purpose, just to keep from sitting still. Sitting meant thinking. Thinking meant replaying every moment of the night in my mind, the way the storm seemed to press against the windows, the flicker of candlelight on the walls, the way the silence between us had felt more alive than any conversation. The drawing was still hidden in the book on the shelf. I had slid it between the pages earlier, but I couldn't stop checking to make sure it was still there. 3 times that day I had pulled the book down, opened it just enough to see the edge of the paper, the faint lines of the pencil sketching me as I had been. Each time I closed the book again, quickly, like touching it too long might make the memory sharper. By early evening, the sky outside had shifted again, soft streaks of orange and pink stretched across the horizon. The streets were drying, the last of the puddles shrinking. The world outside the house looked calm, almost ordinary, as if nothing had happened. But the world inside me wasn't ordinary. I stood at the kitchen counter, my hands resting flat against the cool surface. I could already imagine the sound of my husband's keys turning in the lock, the familiar thud of his shoes in the hallway, the way he'd look around the room without noticing anything had changed. Because to him, nothing had. And that was the part that unsettled me most, the thought of how easily I could slide back into that life, how easily I could move through the evening as though last night had been just another storm. I told myself I would. That I would answer his questions casually, that I would ask about his day, that I would set the table and pour his drink and talk about the weather. I told myself that I could tuck the night away the same way I'd tucked that drawing between pages. But the truth was, I couldn't. I walked to the window and pushed it open. The air was cool, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and distant smoke from someone's chimney. The sound of birds had returned, faint but steady. I stepped out onto the balcony, leaning against the railing. The wood was still damp, and the chill of it pressed into my palms. I looked down at the street, at the neighbors' cars parked in their usual spots, at the life going on as though storms and power outages and candlelit nights never happened. I thought about him. Not in the way that made me ache, but in the way that made me quiet. The way you think about a word you can't quite translate, a dream you woke from too soon. I didn't know if I would ever see him again. I didn't know if I wanted to. But I knew I would never forget him. I looked back into the house. The furniture was the same. The walls were the same. Even I probably looked the same. But I wasn't the same. I would sit at that table again with my husband, I would fold the laundry and sweep the floor and water the plants. I would laugh at the right moments and ask the right questions and move through the days as though nothing had shifted. But something had. It wasn't guilt exactly, not the sharp, punishing kind. It was something softer, stranger. Like a bruise you press on to remind yourself it's there. The drawing stayed on the shelf. I didn't move it. I didn't destroy it. I just left it there, between the pages, waiting. The sky deepened into twilight, and I could hear a car pulling up outside, the crunch of tires on wet gravel, the familiar sound that always meant the same thing. I stayed on the balcony for one more moment, my hands gripping the railing, my breath slow and steady. I thought about the storm, about the night, about the silence that had said more than any words. And I knew, without saying it out loud, that the line I had crossed would never disappear. It would stay, quiet and steady, like the faint smell of rain after the storm is long gone.